What could possibly make a Viking afraid? We're talking about warriors who stormed across Europe, burned cities to the ground, and carved their names into legend. But even the fiercest Norse raiders whispered in fear about something hidden deep in the far north, something they couldn't conquer, couldn't understand, and couldn't forget. This isn't the Viking story you think you know. Buried beneath snow-covered forests and forgotten in most history books is the tale of a mysterious tribe who didn't just survive Viking attacks, they made the Vikings turn back. No castles. No armies. Just the kind of silence that made hardened men stare into the dark and not want to go in. This is the chilling, brilliant story of the Byami. And once you hear it, you'll never look at Viking power the same way again. If you grew up thinking that the Vikings were the scariest people to ever roam medieval Europe, you're not alone. Most of us picture them as unstoppable warriors, storming through villages, crossing oceans in dragon-headed ships, fearless and brutal in battle. They've been the face of conquest, the very image of what it meant to dominate the early medieval world. But what if I told you, there was one group, one mysterious tribe, that made them nervous? A people so elusive, so deeply tied to the wilderness, that the mighty Vikings, yes, those Vikings, actually feared them. Let's take a journey far from the familiar fjords of Norway or the trading hubs of Denmark. Let's head north, way north. Past the last wooden villages, beyond the frozen lakes, into the realm of biting winds and endless snow. Here, in what is now northern Finland, the Kola Peninsula, and parts of northwest Russia, lived a people whose name barely shows up in the mainstream history books, the Byami. They didn't build stone forts. They didn't carve runestones. And they didn't leave behind glorious battle songs. But what they did leave, was a reputation. A chilling reputation that echoed through Viking camps long after the war horns stopped sounding. You see, the Byami weren't a large or well-known civilization. They weren't conquerors in the way Rome or even the Vikings were. They lived quietly, tucked away in the coldest forests of the north, navigating snow-covered valleys and frozen rivers with an ease that seemed unnatural to outsiders. To the Vikings, who were used to coastal raids and large open-field battles, this land was foreign. Hostile. Almost cursed. And the people who thrived there, even more so. Imagine this, a group of Viking warriors, hardened by years of battle, pushing deeper into the northern frontier, thinking they're the apex predator, only to find themselves surrounded by trees too thick to swing a sword in, their footprints erased overnight by fresh snow, and strange symbols carved into the bark of trees. Nothing overt. Nothing loud. Just a quiet presence. A lingering feeling that someone, something, was watching them. That was the first thing about the Byami that set them apart. Their silence. Their invisibility. The Vikings were loud, direct, theatrical in their violence. The Byami? They were shadows in the snow. The Vikings didn't understand how a group of people, who seemed to have no cities, no obvious leaders, no warships, could be so dangerous. They weren't supposed to be. And yet, Viking expeditions that headed too far into Byami territory often ended in disaster. Soldiers went missing. Supply lines vanished. Entire camps would find themselves cut off, slowly and methodically, by enemies they never saw. Stories began to spread. Stories of warriors pierced by silent arrows from trees no one had climbed. Of traps that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Of strange rituals seen from a distance, drums echoing through the woods, masked figures dancing in trance-like states, and fires that burned colors no Viking had ever seen before. Was it witchcraft? Were the Byami even human? These questions began to take root not just in the minds of soldiers, but even among commanders. What truly frightened the Vikings wasn't just the Byami's skill at survival or their tactics, it was the unknown. The Byami refused to play by the familiar rules of war. They weren't interested in glory. They didn't show off. They didn't negotiate. They didn't even always fight back directly. Sometimes they'd simply let nature do the work, guiding intruders into bogs, luring them onto weak ice, or just waiting until hunger and exhaustion took hold. And this wasn't the fear of some mighty empire or superior weapon. This was a more intimate fear. The kind that creeps in when you realize you don't understand your opponent at all. When your maps are useless, your armor weighs you down, and even your firelight can't push back the darkness pressing in from the trees. For the Byami, survival wasn't a challenge, it was a lifestyle. They had lived among the forests and the snows for generations, passing down knowledge about the land, the animals, the seasons, and even the stars. To them, the Vikings were just another group of outsiders who didn't belong. And they treated them accordingly. There are even old merchant records from Novgorod and later from Hansa traders, quietly referencing the forest people of the north, not with hostility, but with caution. Deals had to be carefully negotiated. Paths had to be respected. Because everyone knew, if you upset the Byami, you might not even realize it, until it was far too late. And that's the thing. The Byami didn't conquer lands. They didn't seek tribute. But they defended what was theirs, with patience, silence, and a terrifying understanding of their world. So yes, the Vikings were fearsome. But even the fiercest warriors have blind spots. And in the snowy forests of the far north, their blind spot had a name. The Byami. And that's just the beginning of the story. So, who exactly were the Byami? That's the thing, no one can answer that with absolute certainty. And maybe that's part of the reason they had such an effect on the Vikings. The Byami were not a massive empire. They didn't leave behind stone monuments or detailed chronicles. There were no sagas passed down in the way Norse tales were, no ruins tourists could visit today. The Byami lived in the shadows of history, on the outer edge of the known world, where maps faded into blank whiteness and legends began. They were a forest people. A snow people. A tribe that existed in the deep, silent spaces of the north, in a land where the sun barely rises in winter and never sets in summer. Their homes were temporary, often nothing more than expertly built shelters of hide and bone, designed to vanish without a trace. They moved with the herds, followed the seasons, and listened to the land in ways that outsiders never could. To those who didn't know better, the Byami might have seemed like a scattered group of nomads, isolated and harmless. But that assumption would be a fatal mistake, one the Vikings learned the hard way. What we do know about the Byami comes not from their own words, but from the accounts of those who encountered them, traders, raiders, and a few unlucky survivors of battles they'd rather forget. In these stories, the Byami are rarely described in detail. They aren't painted as villains or monsters. Instead, they're mentioned with a kind of wary respect, like you'd speak of a storm at sea or a mountain pass known for taking lives. The name, Byami, doesn't show up often. But when it does, it's usually followed by a pause. The Vikings, who prided themselves on fearlessness, rarely admitted to fear. Yet in some of their more obscure tales, particularly the ones passed quietly between sailors or shared by campfires after too much mead, there are hints of encounters that shook even the most hardened warriors. Stories of a tribe that didn't fight like other enemies. That didn't charge onto battlefields. That didn't even seem to want to fight at all, until you were already in too deep. You have to understand, the Viking worldview was built on conquest. On the idea that the stronger, bolder, louder force would always win. But the Byami were none of those things. They were small in number. They had no great armies. And yet, time and again, they held their ground. Sometimes through battle. Often without lifting a weapon. What truly haunted the Vikings about the Byami wasn't just the danger, they'd faced danger before. It was the unknowability of them. These were people who seemed to have no written language the Norse could decipher, no centralized leader, no open religion that the Vikings could understand or convert. Everything about the Byami felt closed, hidden, and yet unmistakably intentional. There are merchant logs from Novgorod and a few fragmented records from the Hanseatic League that mention the Byami obliquely. Not by name, always, but in references to northern tribes who speak little, know the winds, and do not barter twice. Traders who tried to push too far, to pry into their hunting grounds or sacred sites, often found themselves turned around, or worse, lost. And those who dealt fairly with the Byami, they often came back with some of the finest pelts, rarest stones, and trained falcons you could find north of the Alps. But even in trade, the Byami kept their distance. They sent few representatives, revealed no maps, and never explained the origins of their goods. They didn't brag. They didn't threaten. They simply existed, on their own terms, in a place where few dared to follow. There's something undeniably powerful about that kind of presence. To command fear and respect without shouting, without drawing a sword, without building walls or palaces. The Byami didn't make history in the way empires do, they made it the way glaciers carve valleys, slowly, quietly, and without asking permission. The Vikings weren't used to that. They were used to measuring strength in steel and in ships. But in the frozen north, those things counted for little. The Byami measured strength differently, in silence, in stillness, in the ability to wait and watch and know that the land would always be on their side. It's not that the Byami were immune to violence. Far from it. When they needed to fight, they fought smart. Strategically. And they fought for survival, not for glory, not for expansion. That kind of warfare confused the Vikings, who saw war as a path to honor. The Byami didn't seem to care about honor in the Norse sense. They cared about continuity. About protecting something much deeper than just territory. In a way, the Byami were the ultimate anti-conqueror. They resisted domination not by meeting it head-on, but by slipping around it. Undermining it. Making it too costly, too confusing, and too frustrating to pursue. That's how you defeat an enemy who thinks they're invincible. You show them they're not fighting a person, or a tribe, or even an army. They're fighting an environment. A culture. A way of life they can't touch or even fully see. And that's why the Byami lingered in Viking memory, not as a people easily beaten or broken, but as something that couldn't quite be explained. A ghost in the snow. A name whispered more often than shouted. If history is written by the victors, then maybe the Byami weren't interested in writing history at all. Maybe they were more interested in outlasting it. And for a time, they did. Now, if the Vikings had one undeniable strength, it was the sea. They were masters of the waves, riding sleek longships that could cut through ocean waters and sail up shallow rivers with equal ease. Their raids were swift, brutal, and often completely unexpected. They understood how to navigate wind and current, how to outmaneuver enemy fleets, and how to use the coastlines of Europe like secret passageways into the heart of rival kingdoms. But once they left the sea, once they pushed inland into a landscape that didn't follow the rules of tides or wind, they began to lose that advantage. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the frozen wilds of the north, where the Byami made their home. To the Vikings, that landscape was disorienting. The forests were thick and dark, blanketed with snow so deep it swallowed boots and slowed carts to a crawl. The rivers froze solid in winter, and the sun barely showed its face for weeks at a time. It was a place where silence ruled, where sound seemed to vanish into the trees, and where warmth was a rare, fleeting thing. To most outsiders, it felt like a world trying to shake you off. But to the Byami, it was home. More than that, it was an ally. They knew the terrain like it was part of their own bodies. Every frozen stream, every sheltering hill, every seasonal path through the trees, they had memorized it all. While the Vikings struggled to find their bearings, the Byami glided over the snow with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. They wore handcrafted snowshoes that distributed their weight, allowing them to walk where Viking boots would sink. They strapped narrow wooden skis to their feet and moved across open drifts in near silence. And when they needed to carry more or move faster, they hitched sleds to teams of hardy dogs that could race through the snow for miles without stopping. This wasn't just survival. It was mastery, and that mastery extended beyond just movement. The Byami knew how to live in this frozen world without fighting it. While Viking raiding parties fumbled with tents and struggled to keep fires going in brutal winds, the Byami could construct fully insulated shelters in a matter of minutes. These weren't grand buildings or permanent homes, they were functional, efficient, and almost invisible. Covered in furs and bark, anchored into the snow, and designed to hold warmth with minimal fuel. They could vanish into the woods and reappear days later, rested and ready, as if they'd never left. Their clothing was equally advanced. Where Viking warriors wore layered wool and leather, the Byami crafted garments from the furs of Arctic animals, seal, fox, reindeer, stitched with sinew and softened with fish oil. These coats weren't just warm. They were nearly windproof, water-resistant, and designed to work with the body's heat, not against it. In bitter cold, that difference meant everything. To the Byami, the snow wasn't an obstacle. It was cover. It muffled their steps, obscured their movements, and helped them vanish when needed. They used it like a tool, sometimes even like a weapon. They knew how to set traps that took advantage of soft snowbanks or brittle ice. They understood how to lure enemies into valleys where snow could be loosed from above in a deadly slide. And when they moved, they left little behind. No deep footprints. No campfires smoldering. No tracks that lasted more than a few hours in the changing wind. For the Vikings, used to the open ocean and wide coastal plains, this was a nightmare. The forest closed in around them. Their weapons were too heavy, their clothing too cumbersome, and their instincts, honed for raiding farms and coastal towns, meant little here. Even their legendary longships were useless in a land where rivers froze and harbors turned to fields of ice. And slowly, that realization began to set in. They weren't just fighting another tribe. They were fighting the environment itself. And the Byami had made that environment their strongest ally. That's what made them so dangerous. Not numbers. Not brute strength. But a deep, inherited knowledge of a land that most couldn't even endure for a week. They knew how to move, how to hide, how to survive when others froze. They didn't need to win battles outright. They just had to outlast. Outmaneuver. Outthink. The Vikings may have been the terror of the seas. But on land, on this land, they were clumsy, loud, and slow. And the Byami made sure they never forgot it. It's easy, in hindsight, to underestimate how important that environmental edge was. But think about it, every culture builds its strategies, its weapons, its beliefs around the world it lives in. The Vikings built theirs around ships and steel. The Byami built theirs around ice, shadow, and silence. And when those two worlds collided, it wasn't always the louder one that won. That's the thing about people like the Byami. You don't notice them until it's too late. They don't charge into your camp. They don't make demands. They don't call themselves warriors or kings. They simply know where to be, when to strike, and how to disappear. And in the frozen wilds of the north, that's more powerful than any sword. When it came to war, the Byami didn't follow anyone's rules, especially not the Vikings. If the Norse warriors were known for anything, it was their order in chaos. That might sound contradictory, but Viking combat was highly structured beneath all the screaming and fury. They fought in formation, using the famed shield wall, a tight-knit phalanx of overlapping shields and disciplined strikes. It was an ancient tactic, but incredibly effective when executed by trained warriors who trusted each other. In a flat, open battlefield, it was almost impossible to break, but the Byami never gave them that kind of battlefield. In fact, they made sure such a place didn't exist. To the Byami, direct confrontation was suicide. They didn't have the numbers, the armor, or the need to prove themselves in glorious battle. They had something far more dangerous, patience. And a deep understanding that if they fought the Vikings on Viking terms, they would lose. So they didn't. Instead, they rewrote the rules. They struck at night, often when visibility was poor or during snowstorms so thick you couldn't see your own breath. They waited until the enemy had grown tired, cold, and frustrated, until routine and confidence had dulled their awareness. Then they moved. Fast. Silent. Precise. There was no warning. No trumpet. No battle cry. Just a blur in the darkness, the faint whisper of a bowstring, or the snap of a twig that came half a second too late. Then a body dropped. Maybe two. Sometimes a fire was kicked into the snow. Sometimes a tent collapsed onto sleeping men. And then, nothing. Silence again. Just the howling wind and the slow, creeping fear that settled over the Viking camp like frost on steel. The Byami didn't aim to wipe out armies. They aimed to destabilize them. They went for the sentries, the scouts, the lieutenants. The men who held the structure together. They understood how Viking warbands worked. Take out a few key voices, and suddenly the whole unit turns from a killing machine into a confused, disorganized crowd. They used bows, but not the heavy war bows favored by other European powers. These were hunting bows, compact, flexible, deadly at close range. You wouldn't hear them being drawn. You wouldn't see the arrow coming. They also carried long, narrow spears, more like extended knives than proper pikes. And then there were the blades, short, curved, wicked little things that looked more like animal claws than weapons. These weren't weapons designed for clashing on the front lines. They were for getting in and out. For cutting just deep enough. For doing damage without getting bogged down. Every strike was deliberate. There was no wasting energy, no grand gesture, no unnecessary bloodshed. Byami warriors didn't get caught up in the noise of war. They slipped through it, like shadows weaving through firelight. By the time a Viking warband realized what was happening, the attackers were already gone. And that, more than anything, rattled the Vikings. Because these were men who relied on structure, on predictability. They trained for battles that followed a rhythm. The shield wall forms, the clash begins, the stronger side pushes forward. But the Byami never gave them a rhythm. They never gave them a shape to fight. Just movement. Confusion. Isolation. Imagine you're a Viking scout, moving ahead of your unit in unfamiliar woods. The snow is knee-deep, your legs are sore, and every shadow looks like something waiting to strike. You hear a snap. You turn. Nothing. Then a flash of movement. You reach for your sword, too late. You go down. No one hears it, or maybe you're a guard on night duty. The fire is low. You're watching, but not really seeing. There's too much dark between the trees. Suddenly, the flame sputters, snow thrown over it. Someone brushes past you, fast as wind. You shout. No one responds. Because no one else saw anything. And by morning, the camp is short one or two more men. It's easy to imagine how that would wear on the mind. The Vikings may have been warriors, but they were still human. They got tired. They got paranoid. And the Byami knew exactly how to feed that paranoia. Some commanders tried to adjust. They posted more guards. They marched in tighter formations. But it didn't help much. The terrain still favored the Byami. The cold still seeped in. The trees still stood like sentinels, hiding eyes you couldn't see. Over time, even the most seasoned Viking fighters started second-guessing themselves. Every branch crack became a threat. Every snowdrift looked like it might hide something beneath it. The Byami had made the forest their ally. The Vikings, in contrast, were simply passing through. What made this strategy so effective wasn't just the physical toll, it was the psychological one. The Vikings weren't used to being hunted. They were used to doing the hunting. But in these forests, under that cold sky, the roles were reversed, and the Baiami didn't need to win every skirmish. They didn't need to kill every Viking. All they needed to do was remind them, again and again, that they were not safe. That this was not their land. That every step forward might be a mistake. That kind of fear lingers. It spreads. And soon, even the bravest warriors start looking over their shoulders, wondering if they're being watched. Wondering if this forest, this strange, silent place, is going to let them leave. And more than a few never did. But what truly set the Baiami apart, what pushed them from being merely clever warriors into something almost supernatural in Viking eyes, was their mastery of psychological warfare. If you think of war as only blades and arrows, you're missing half the battle. Fear is a weapon too. And the Baiami wielded it with terrifying precision. To start, they knew how to make themselves felt without being seen. It began with the symbols. Strange carvings on trees, spirals, claw-like marks, runes that weren't from any Viking alphabet. Shapes arranged in ways that looked deliberate but made no sense. Sometimes they were gouged deep into the bark. Other times, they were subtle, like scratches you might not notice until it was too late. And then there were the bones. In the middle of a frozen trail, where a Viking patrol expected nothing but snow, they might find an eerie arrangement of animal skulls and limbs, carefully laid out in circles, lines, or shapes that looked like people, wolves, or worse. Bones weren't just scattered. They were placed. And there was no sign of who did it or when. It was as if they'd been summoned from the ground itself. These weren't random tokens of nature. These were messages. And they spoke loud and clear to the Viking mind: you are not alone. Something is watching. Something not human. You see, the Vikings, for all their battle-hardened toughness, were deeply superstitious. They believed in spirits, omens, gods, curses. When they saw those carvings, those bone shapes, they didn't think, we're fighting another tribe. They thought, we've stepped into cursed land. They believed they were trespassing on something ancient, something that didn't follow the rules of men, and the Baiami knew it. They counted on it, because fear weakens judgment. Superstition makes warriors hesitate. And the more you believe your enemy is something unnatural, the harder it is to swing your sword with confidence. But the Baiami didn't stop at symbols. They took it even further. Sometimes, just beyond the tree line, Viking scouts would catch a glimpse of a figure, tall, draped in furs, wearing the mask of an elk or a bear. Not moving. Just watching. And when they turned to alert their comrades, the figure would vanish. As if it had never been there. Other times, deep in the night, distant drums would echo through the woods. Slow. Rhythmic. Like a heartbeat. Accompanied by flickering flames that danced in strange patterns across the snow. The wind would carry strange chants, low, guttural sounds, not words but something older, something primal. These were not battle cries. They were rituals. The Baiami practiced shamanic ceremonies before and during their campaigns. Around their fires, hidden deep in the forest, they'd don animal masks, crafted from the skulls and hides of the creatures they hunted. They'd paint their bodies in ash, blood, and earth. They'd chant and drum, calling on spirits of the land, the ancestors, the beasts. Some of it was deeply spiritual, rooted in their connection to the world around them. But they also knew exactly what kind of effect it had on outsiders. To the Vikings, who understood the world through the lens of gods and monsters, this wasn't some cultural rite, it was sorcery. These weren't warriors, they were shapeshifters. They were men who could call down ghosts. Men who fought alongside wolves. Men who became something else entirely when the drumming started. There are even stories, half legend, half report, of Viking survivors swearing they saw a Baiami warrior vanish into thin air during a chase. Or that an entire group of fighters heard voices calling their names in the snow, leading them into ambushes they never saw coming. Some said they saw warriors rise from the dead. Others said the trees themselves whispered warnings in Byami tongues. Of course, it's likely those were exaggerations. Fear makes the mind play tricks. But to the Byami, that was the whole point. They didn't need to transform into beasts. They just needed the Vikings to think they could. And it worked. The fear became viral. Even Viking leaders, hardened men who had crossed oceans and faced down Saxon kings, began giving the forest strange nicknames: the Ghost Wood, the White Hell, the Land of Vanishing Eyes. They warned their men to keep charms close, to avoid lighting fires at night, to leave offerings of meat or silver when traveling alone. They wrote to their families about invisible enemies and unholy shrines. And more than once, they simply turned around and left. Because how do you fight an enemy you can't see? How do you fight someone who might not even be human? The Byami understood that terror doesn't just strike the body, it seeps into the spirit. It corrodes morale. It makes strong men second-guess their next move. And sometimes, that's all it takes to win a battle. They didn't need overwhelming numbers. They didn't need siege engines or warships. They had the snow, the shadows, and the ancient fear of the unknown. That was enough. By the time a Viking army managed to regroup, to mount a real counterattack, the Byami would already be gone, leaving behind only ashes, bones, and the memory of drums that still echoed through the trees long after the fire died. And so, to the Norse, the Byami became something more than a rival tribe. They became a myth, a cold, whispering presence in the north. A reminder that no matter how fierce a warrior you are, there's always someone who plays the game better. Someone who doesn't just fight the body, but breaks the mind. But perhaps the most haunting part of the Byami wasn't the warriors themselves. It was their dead. You see, for the Byami, death wasn't an ending. It was a transition. A shift in presence. And while their warriors were very much alive, quick, strategic, unpredictable, the spirits of their ancestors were never far behind. This wasn't just belief. It was practice. The Byami didn't bury their dead under dirt. They didn't set them aflame on rafts, like the Norse. Instead, they took their ancestors, carefully wrapped and preserved, and placed them in sacred, hidden places, deep within glacial caves, inside stone crevices high in the mountains, or within hollow trees sealed with pitch and symbols. These places weren't chosen at random. Each location was seen as a threshold between worlds, spots where the living and the dead could still touch. And they didn't just leave the bodies there, they tended to them. Every season, members of the clan would make the long trek, sometimes across miles of snow and ice, to offer gifts, speak prayers, leave food, feathers, stones. Children were brought to learn the names and stories of the ancestors, to sit in silence and listen to the wind carry the voices of old ones. These weren't just rituals. These were visits. The dead, to them, were still present. Still aware. Still watching. And they believed, fully and without hesitation, that their ancestors protected them. The Vikings had their own notions of ancestral honor, of course. They believed that dying in battle granted you entry to Valhalla, where you'd feast and fight forever. They respected bloodlines, sung songs of heroic forebears. But what the Byami practiced went deeper, darker. To the Norse, encountering a people who communed with their dead, who made decisions based on messages from frozen tombs, who carved ice-ruined paths to lead ancestral spirits to and from battle, it wasn't just unfamiliar. It was unnerving, because how do you kill a warrior whose spirit lives on in a cave above your camp? How do you defeat a family that believes their fallen are still there, whispering strategy, watching from the cold? There are stories, quiet ones, told in low voices in Viking winter halls, of warriors who stumbled across one of these sacred places. A glacial cave with a narrow entrance, marked by stones in the shape of rising moons. Inside, a shelf of frozen mist, and then a row of seated figures, wrapped in seal pelts and bone beads, eyes hollow but strangely alert, skin preserved by ice and air. Some had markings still visible on their cheeks. Others wore talismans of carved bone. All of them watched in silence. One Norseman, the story goes, saw one of the eyes blink. He ran. Another tale tells of a war band that set fire to a Byami camp and found a nearby burial hollow. They desecrated it, mocking the practice, stealing relics, even cutting down one of the ancient trees meant to mark the passage to the spirit world. Within days, the entire band vanished. Not a single footprint was left. Not a single weapon. Only a scorched tree stump, surrounded by a perfect circle of fresh snow, untouched by wind. Whether these stories were true or just campfire legend, it didn't matter. Their power lay in the belief. Because the Vikings began to treat Byami territory differently. They moved more cautiously. Avoided certain ridges. Refused to enter fog-covered valleys where no birds sang. They left offerings of iron or silver at the edge of forests they didn't understand. They weren't afraid of the warriors. They were afraid of what stood behind them. To the Byami, the ancestors weren't memories. They were part of the family, the tribe, the strategy. They guided dreams, changed weather, protected children, cursed enemies. It was said that a warrior going into battle could ask for the breath of 100 grandfathers behind their spear. That even if they fell, the wind would carry their soul directly into the nearest sacred cave, where they'd sit, watch, and wait. And this wasn't just whispered folklore. You could see it in their eyes. The Byami warriors weren't reckless. They didn't fight as if desperate to survive. They fought with the calm of people who believed that even death was just a relocation. A change of position. A movement into the role of protector. And so to the Norse, it felt like fighting against something endless. You might win a skirmish. You might even burn a village. But the Byami didn't break. They didn't fade. They returned, quietly, patiently, like snow returning each year, reinforced not just by new warriors, but by the endless presence of those who came before. In the Viking worldview, battle was a proving ground. A theater of glory. But for the Byami, it was a continuation of duty. Even in death, their warriors stood guard, silent sentinels in the cold, watching over the land and the people who still breathed. To the Vikings, that was the part they could never quite understand, and never truly defeat. Because when you believe that the land itself is haunted by those who loved it too much to leave, when every frozen branch and icy gust might be carrying the thoughts of 1,000 dead eyes, it gets harder to raise your sword. And sometimes, that's all it takes. If the Vikings thought the Byami were just elusive warriors hiding in the snow, they were in for a surprise. Because the Byami weren't just surviving out there in the frozen reaches. They were thriving. While most outsiders saw only endless ice, windswept tundra, and forests too dense to be useful, the Byami saw something entirely different. They saw wealth. And they knew exactly how to use it, without ever revealing where it came from. You see, the Byami had access to some of the most valuable goods in all of medieval Europe. Rich pelts, soft as down but tougher than any cloth, came from creatures the Vikings barely saw alive. Arctic fox, sable, ermine, seal. Their furs, perfectly prepared and preserved, fetched prices that rivaled silver in faraway markets. Then there was the amber, golden, glowing like frozen sunlight, washed up on desolate northern shores and gathered quietly, grain by grain. And walrus ivory, carved into tools or tokens, rarer than the tusks of elephants and twice as coveted. Not to mention the falcons, majestic birds trained in ways that stunned even the caliphates of the south, sold to lords who ruled cities the Byami would never step foot in. All this, gathered by a people most Europeans didn't even believe were real. But the true genius of the Byami wasn't in what they had. It was in how they kept it hidden. The Vikings, bold and restless, believed that power came from showing strength. Claiming land. Marking your presence. They built longhouses, palisades, and harbors. They planted flags, figuratively and literally, and dared anyone to take them down. The Bayami did the opposite. They vanished. Their camps moved like drifting snow. Their trade routes changed with the seasons. Even their meeting points with outsiders, merchants, travelers, and occasionally very confused Viking envoys, were temporary, neutral places. Ice-covered riverbanks. Wind-beaten hills. Isolated clearings that would be buried under snow or mud a week later. No one ever saw the same trading post twice, and they never brought traders into their true lands. Instead, they used intermediaries, sometimes other tribes, sometimes hired speakers who didn't even know who they were representing. Goods were wrapped in birch bark, sealed with unfamiliar symbols, and passed from hand to hand until they reached the bustling markets of Novgorod, Dorstad, or even Constantinople. The chain was long. And always cold at the source. It drove the Vikings mad. They knew that someone out there was sitting on resources worth fortunes. And every time they tried to follow the thread back, it vanished like mist on a fjord. They'd find a trader, who knew a messenger, who knew a hunter, who met a man in the woods, and then nothing. Once, a Viking jarl sent a warband north to seize the rumored rich lands beyond the ice. They returned 3 weeks later, frostbitten and empty-handed, swearing they'd followed the tracks of a sled for days, only for the trail to split in 2, then 4, then disappear entirely beneath falling snow. They didn't even find a footprint. But make no mistake, those same Bayami traders could track a deer through a snowstorm at night. They just didn't want to be found, and they protected what was theirs. There were attempts, of course. Viking raids. Quick strikes on what they thought were Bayami supply routes or storage caches. But they never found the main sources. Just decoys. Sometimes they found fur, old, moth-eaten, left as bait. Or crates filled with stones and wrapped in fine pelts. Once, they found a stash of amber, only to discover it was dyed resin, convincing at a glance, but worthless under fire. And more often than not, they didn't return at all, because while the Bayami didn't fight for glory, they defended with precision. They let the raiders think they were winning, allowed them to march deeper into the forest or farther across the tundra. Then, without a sound, they cut the path behind them. Collapsed bridges of ice. Blocked passes. Set traps that weren't deadly, just confusing, designed to turn the wild into a maze. And always, they struck only when the invaders were tired, disoriented, and cold. By the time the Vikings realized they were the hunted, it was already too late. Back in their longhouses, around smoky hearths, Viking leaders argued over maps with missing corners. They talked of caravans that vanished, of traders who returned spooked and silent. Some believed the Bayami were more spirit than human, forest ghosts with ivory knives. Others insisted they were just men, no different from anyone else. But deep down, most of them knew the truth. The Bayami had something the Vikings never did: discretion. They knew how to hide strength until it mattered. They knew that revealing a source meant risking it. They didn't own the land, they moved with it, disappeared into it, became part of it. And because of that, their resources remained untouched, their wealth untraceable, and their world, quietly, skillfully, unconquered. So yes, the Vikings may have sailed farther, fought louder, written more songs, but the Bayami, they traded secrets for silver, and never gave up a single inch in return. There was another thing that set the Bayami apart, something that confused the Vikings even more than their vanishing trade routes or eerie forest symbols. It was the women. In Norse society, strength was measured in muscle, scars, and how many battles you'd survived. And for the Vikings, that strength almost always came from men. Women held influence, yes, some ruled farms, managed households, and could even demand divorce, but warfare, trade, shamanic rites, those were considered male domains. Even the legendary shield maidens, often spoken of in sagas, were seen more as exceptions than rules, and many doubted they ever existed at all. But the Bayami had no such doubts. In their world, women weren't tucked away in the safety of homes or left behind when the hunt began. They were out there, moving through the same forests, crossing the same icy passes, striking the same trade bargains, chanting the same battle prayers. And they weren't following. They were leading. The first time a Viking envoy met a Bayami trader, he assumed the young woman standing at the head of the caravan was just there to translate or carry goods. He directed his questions to the older man beside her, only to be quietly corrected. She was the one he should speak to. She held the contracts. She set the terms. The man, apparently, was just there to handle the dogs. It was an awkward moment. But it was far from unique, because among the Bayami, women could be, and often were, traders, hunters, spiritual leaders, and even military commanders. Their status wasn't symbolic. It was practical. In the far north, survival didn't care about gender. You pulled your weight, or you didn't eat. And over time, that mindset shaped a society where roles weren't handed out based on birth, but on ability. Archaeologists much later would dig up frozen tombs in the Bayami region, beautifully preserved by the ice. In one grave, they found a ceremonial staff wrapped in otter hide, a bundle of polished amber beads, and a knife so finely balanced it must have been custom forged. Next to it were several hunting arrows, tipped with bone, and a carved totem shaped like a bear's jaw. But the skeleton lying beneath those treasures wasn't what anyone expected. It was a woman. The remains showed the wear of someone used to walking long distances, hip joints wide and strong, arms roped with muscle. Her teeth had been ground smooth, likely from years of chewing leather or bark. She wasn't a passive figure placed in a tomb by grieving family. She was a leader. Possibly a shaman. Maybe even a war chief. And she wasn't alone. Other graves told similar stories, women buried not just with household tools, but with weapons, trade seals, ceremonial masks, and trophies that could only have been taken in battle. One site, still only partially uncovered, seemed to contain the remains of a woman surrounded by offerings from 5 different regions, suggesting she had traveled extensively and held diplomatic or spiritual sway far beyond her home. To the Bayami, this was natural. To the Vikings, it was deeply unsettling, not because they believed women were weak, but because they had built their identity on the assumption that certain things simply were. Men fought. Men led. Men made decisions, and women supported them. To meet a people where that line was not just blurred but almost non-existent forced them to question more than just their enemies. It made them question themselves. One Viking skald, writing years after an unsuccessful expedition into Bayami territory, described a strange encounter with what he called a fire priestess. She stood on a ridge, cloaked in fox fur, her face painted with ash and ochre, and beat a wide drum that seemed to echo off the mountains. He claimed her voice was like the howl of wind, and that the warriors around her didn't move until she gave the sign. When she raised her arm, they vanished into the trees. When she struck the drum a second time, arrows flew like a swarm of angry bees. The skald never saw her fight directly. She didn't need to. She commanded, and in Viking eyes, that was perhaps even more frightening, because how do you conquer a people who don't play by your rules? How do you intimidate an army when their leader wears no helmet, carries no axe, and might be someone you'd assumed wasn't even a threat? The Bayami didn't set out to challenge gender roles. They didn't think of themselves as revolutionaries. They were simply pragmatic. In a place where the sun could vanish for months and the snow could bury a village overnight, everyone needed to be ready. Everyone needed to be useful. And if a woman could barter better, hunt sharper, or read the wind more accurately, why wouldn't she lead? It wasn't a question for them, but it was a revelation for others. Over time, this aspect of Bayami culture became one of the most whispered about features in northern trading posts. Merchants returning from winter market spoke of northern queens, who could read a man's intentions like a scroll. Hunters told tales of fierce ice sisters who could move through the forest without a sound. And some Viking raiders, more superstitious than others, began to believe that every Byami woman was a kind of spellcaster, half spirit, half soldier. They weren't far off, because the Byami had tapped into something powerful. Not just survival. Not just secrecy. But balance. A way of living that didn't waste strength, wherever it came from. A society that didn't underestimate half its people, and, because of that, was nearly impossible to break. In the eyes of the world, the Byami remained mysterious. Elusive. Ghostly. But to those who got close, even for a moment, there was no mystery, only respect. And the quiet, unshakable truth, in the far north, power wore many faces, and not all of them had beards. If the Vikings still harbored thoughts of conquering the Byami after all their strange encounters and failed raids, one event in the year 1026 would change everything. It came during the reign of Olaf II of Norway, a Christian king known both for his fiery zeal and his ambition to unify the northern lands under one faith, one crown. Olaf had already subdued rebellious jarls, converted villages by sword and sermon, and pushed Norse power deep into Finnish and Sami territory. But the Byami, perched in the far reaches beyond the Lake Canero, remained untouchable. They weren't just resisting his faith. They were ignoring him entirely. To Olaf, that was unacceptable, and so, in the summer of 1026, he launched what was to be his most decisive campaign, a full military incursion into Byami territory, with the goal of wiping out their resistance once and for all. He brought with him seasoned warriors, longboats with black sails, war priests with relics, and enough steel to arm 3 battalions. They traveled light and swift, cutting through lake paths, dragging their boats across the shallows, certain that the Byami would scatter once the might of Norway appeared on their doorstep. Instead, they walked into a ghost town. The village that Olaf's scouts discovered on the western shore of Canero looked oddly welcoming, too quiet, too perfect. The thatched roofs were intact, fire pits still warm, and racks of dried fish hung from poles as if the people had just stepped away for the evening. Olaf ordered his men to occupy it immediately. Tents were raised. Fires were lit. Horses were watered. Then came the smell. At first, no one could quite place it. A sour, greasy tang that drifted on the wind, clung to the trees, seeped from the soil. Some thought it was rotting meat. Others blamed the marshes nearby. But then the night came, and with it, fire. It began with a hiss, then a roar. From the tree line beyond the village, Byami warriors emerged not in waves but in shadows, silent, coordinated, and moving like spirits of the forest. They hurled clay pots filled with thick, tarry black paste, an ancient mixture of animal fat, sulfur, pine resin, and crushed charcoal. The pots shattered mid-air, splattering tents, walls, and supply crates with a sticky sludge. And then, they lit them. Flames erupted not in gentle bursts, but in violent jets, snaking up ropes, along tent flaps, across wooden beams. The fire clung to Viking armor, fed on oiled shields, and turned the humid summer air into a storm of smoke and sparks. The Norse called it Sleipsvard, the sleeping black fire, because it came without warning and moved with the malice of something alive. The village wasn't abandoned. It was bait. By the time Olaf realized the trap, it was too late. His men rushed to flee, but the paths they had come from were gone. The rivers had been blocked by felled trees. The marshes flooded. The forest trails choked with spiked barricades and concealed pits. Worse still, the Byami had released clouds of thick, yellow smoke from concealed urns, burning pungent herbs and animal matter that produced a choking fog. Veterans dropped to their knees, hacking and gasping. Warhorses panicked and bolted. Arrows, fired from the dark tree line, came not in volleys but in whispers, single shafts aimed precisely and patiently. No charge. No open battle. Just pressure. Smoke. Heat. Fear. And silence. Olaf tried to regroup at the edge of the burning village, only to find half his captains missing. His priests had vanished in the chaos. His best archers were blind with smoke. He ordered a retreat, but had nowhere to go. The boats, hidden near the river, had already been burned. What was meant to be a swift victory turned into a desperate crawl through an unknown land, where the air itself seemed to turn against them. Some say Olaf himself nearly died that night, dragged away by 2 loyal guards, delirious from the smoke, armor blistering from the heat. When they finally emerged from the forest 2 days later, the king was silent. His beard was singed. His hands were trembling. He left behind more than 300 dead, with many more scattered and never seen again. The Norse sagas would later call it the Battle of the Sleeping Fires, but among the Baiami, it was never called a battle. To them, it was a lesson. They had always known they couldn't match the Vikings blade for blade. So they rewrote the rules. They turned the land into their ally. The smoke, the marsh, the trees, all became weapons. The fire, slow and deliberate, was not just meant to kill. It was meant to break the spirit. And it worked. After 1026, no Viking king ever again launched a full-scale invasion of Baiami lands. Skirmishes still occurred, of course, ambitious raiders always tried their luck, but the grand campaigns stopped. Traders spoke in hushed tones about the fire people of the north. And even Olaf, once recovered, never mentioned the Baiami in public again. It was as if they'd been erased from memory, but not from fear. What remained was a kind of hush, a blank space on maps, a caution in songs, a warning passed between captains. If you sailed too far east of Canero, the stories said, the forest would start watching you. And if you found a perfect village with warm fires and empty homes, turn back, quickly, because the Baiami had no use for monuments, no desire for conquest, and no thirst for glory. But if you brought fire to their lands, they would return it, with interest. History doesn't always end with a bang. Sometimes, it fades, quietly, gradually, like the last embers of a fire burning low. That's how it was with the Baiami. After the year 1200, the world around them changed. And it changed fast. The great Christian kingdoms of the north, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, had grown from warring tribes into organized, centralized powers. The church, once a distant rumor on the edge of Baiami lands, now sent bishops, envoys, and missionaries deep into the forests. Novgorod, once just a cluster of wooden huts, blossomed into a fortified trading empire pushing outward in every direction. The Hanseatic League, a German merchant power, began tying the Baltic Sea together with trade routes like a giant's net. Suddenly, the wild lands where the Baiami once moved freely weren't so wild anymore. The smoke of war gave way to the ink of treaties. Swords were replaced by ledgers. But in the quiet march of progress, something else was happening, something slower, harder to notice at first. The Baiami stopped being dangerous. They started being useful. At first, it was strategic. Some Baiami groups offered their services as wilderness guides, translators, and winter scouts. Others traded directly with Novgorod or Hansa merchants, supplying furs, amber, medicinal herbs, and northern birds prized by nobles in faraway courts. They were valuable in the way all remote peoples eventually become, exotic but practical, distant but profitable. For a time, this shift was peaceful. There were no more battles, no burning villages, no sleeping fires. Just agreements and handshakes and a growing sense that the old ways were becoming inconvenient. Nomadic lifestyles didn't sit well with the new world. The church needed parishes, not tents. The traders needed fixed towns, not wandering bands. Even friendly governors and merchant lords began to pressure the Baiami to settle, for their own good, of course. And little by little, they did. Some moved into permanent homes near lakes or hillforts. Others married into local families, adopted new customs, learned new prayers. The Baiami became integrated, first socially, then economically, then spiritually. The process wasn't violent. It wasn't even deliberate, not always. But it was constant. And irreversible. The sacred sites, the mountain hollows, the glacial caves, the birch-ringed meadows, were the first to go. To outsiders, they looked like wilderness. To the Byami, they were the beating heart of the world. But heartbeats don't show up on maps. So the places where ancestors were said to dwell, where shamans whispered to the wind, were logged, cleared, drained, mined, built over. Wooden chapels were planted where stone cairns once stood. A road was laid across the whispering field. No one remembered why it was called that. Even the language began to slip. Children born into mixed households spoke the trade dialect first. Byami phrases, rich with rhythm and forest imagery, were harder to write, harder to teach. So they vanished. Songs stopped being sung. Legends became bedtime stories. And the stories changed, as they always do. What was once a fierce warning became a quaint tale. The spirits became metaphor. The ancestors became footnotes. By the 14th century, most Byami had either settled or scattered. Some were absorbed into Finnish or Sami communities, their names altered by church scribes or lost entirely. Others moved further into the interior, away from the roads and towns, trying to preserve what little was left. But the world had caught up. Even the far edges weren't far enough anymore. There were no final battles. No heroic last stands. Just a slow forgetting. Travelers still heard rumors, of course. Strange old men who lived in the hills, speaking no known language. Women who healed with herbs no one else dared to touch. A carved staff found buried deep in a peat bog, inlaid with symbols no scholar could decipher. But those were oddities now, fragments. They were studied, debated, put behind glass in museums. No one feared the Byami anymore, but sometimes, deep in the northern woods, a hunter would stop mid-step, sure he was being watched. Or a fisherman would find a hand-woven charm hanging from a tree near his camp, though he'd seen no one for miles. Or a child would dream of animals speaking in human voices, warning them of fire. And sometimes, when the frost came early and hard, old men in wooden houses would sit near the stove, staring into the flames. They'd say, mostly to themselves, "This reminds me of the sleeping fires." They never meant the heat. They meant the silence that followed, because the Byami didn't disappear. Not really. A people like that don't just vanish. They scatter. They survive in fragments, in the curve of a ritual knife, in the rhythm of a lullaby, in the way someone still ties their boots or prays when no one is watching. They linger in the quiet corners of memory, where history doesn't bother to write. Maybe that's the final trick of the Byami. They fought not with brute force, but with patience. They were never trying to conquer the world. They were just trying to stay part of it, on their own terms. And when those terms became impossible, they did what they'd always done. They moved like shadows, and let the world forget. And then, like mist over a morning lake, the Byami disappeared. Not in a single moment. Not with fire or war or grand tragedy. But slowly, over generations. One family married into another. One custom was forgotten. One word fell out of use. It started with kinship. The Byami, once tightly knit along clan lines, began marrying outside their own circles. First with the Sami to the north, people of reindeer and sky songs. Then with the Karelians to the east, who farmed the cold soil and sang poems that seemed to echo Byami cadences. These weren't betrayals. They were unions born of trust, proximity, survival. But like two rivers merging, something gets diluted. With each marriage, each shared home, each blended tradition, the Byami culture softened at the edges. Old rites were simplified. Stories were retold with new names, new meanings. A sacred song became a wedding tune. A battle chant turned into a lullaby. The lines that defined where Byami began and others ended became blurry. Then they faded. By the time Christian scribes began recording the peoples of the far north, the Byami were already hard to distinguish. Some were called forest Karelians. Others were lumped in with Sami herders or described simply as heathen tribes. Their name didn't always appear in records. But their presence lingered, quiet and persistent, like a root system under snow. What remains of the Byami today isn't much. A carved amber pendant in a museum in Helsinki. A fragment of bowstring woven from birch fiber and wolf sinew. A burial site with a woman's bones, a bronze staff, and 2 hawk talons nestled near her ribs. And stories. Always, stories. Old fishermen on the Finnish side of the border still speak of people who vanished into the fog. Forest spirits that guided or warned. Villages that would pack up and disappear overnight, leaving no tracks. There's a tale about a smoke witch who once led a Viking war band into a swamp and was never seen again. The stories don't say Byami. But they don't have to. Names are often the first thing to vanish. But the lessons remain. And that, more than anything, is what survives of the Byami, the lesson. They didn't defeat the Vikings with brute force. They weren't stronger, better armed, or more numerous. They didn't build castles. They didn't hold territory. They didn't march in lines or die for flags. They simply made conquest not worth it. They made the cost of invasion too high, the rewards too low. They wove fear and confusion into the forest paths. They struck at night, disappeared by dawn. They used mud and mist and memory like weapons. They watched and waited. They outlasted. It wasn't war in the traditional sense. It was resistance as survival. It was asymmetric, psychological, rooted in deep knowledge of terrain and timing and the way fear settles into the hearts of even the boldest men. It was understanding that not every battle needs to be won, so long as the enemy no longer wants to fight. They didn't burn down Viking longships. They made the Vikings afraid to dock them. They didn't build walls around their homes. They made it so outsiders could never find them twice. They didn't conquer Europe, but they made sure Europe never conquered them either, at least, not while they still had the power to choose. That strategy, of quiet, intelligent resistance, outlived the Byami name. It echoed in other parts of the world, the Maroons of the Caribbean, the hill tribes of Southeast Asia, the desert clans of North Africa. It became a blueprint for survival when facing forces too large to match directly. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing. That a people without a written language, without iron armies or stone fortresses, could leave behind not a ruin, but an idea. The idea that survival is not just luck, it's a skill, a choice, a kind of intelligence. The Byami understood their world deeply. Not just the moss-covered trails and hidden lakes, but the minds of those who entered their domain. They knew fear. They knew greed. They knew how stories spread faster than armies. They turned invisibility into power. Confusion into a shield. And mystery into a weapon stronger than any axe. In the end, they didn't win in the way history books usually define it. There was no flag. No treaty. No kingdom. But they endured, long enough to see the world change, long enough to shape the legends that would survive them. And maybe that's the point. Not all victories are loud. Not all heroes ride into battle. Some whisper through the trees. Some carry their homes on their backs. Some survive by knowing when to fight, and when to vanish. So the next time you're walking through a quiet stretch of pine forest along the Russian-Finnish border, and the fog rolls in, and the wind shifts just right, stop for a moment. Listen. You might hear the whisper of leaves, or the sound of footsteps that don't match your own, or nothing at all, which, in the story of the Byami, means everything. If there was one thing the Byami mastered, one skill that truly set them apart, it was the art of disappearing. Not just vanishing in the physical sense, though they were certainly experts at that. Entire Byami villages could melt into the forest in a matter of hours, leaving behind nothing but the impression of wind-blown leaves and the faint scent of wood smoke. Paths would be erased. Footprints brushed away. Fires doused with pine needles and snow. What looked like a trail would lead you in circles. What seemed like silence was, in fact, carefully orchestrated stillness. But their true power wasn't just in hiding. It was in never being fully seen in the first place. The Bayami didn't build walls. They didn't carve their names into stone. They didn't raise monuments to their chiefs or leave scrolls of history behind. They didn't declare themselves a kingdom, or form an empire, or draft borders. And yet, they were there, right at the edges of the known world. In the misty pine barrens. Along the shores of lakes whose names have been forgotten. Not a people of conquest, but of presence. Quiet, constant, and always just out of reach. This refusal to be easily defined, to be categorized like so many other tribes and peoples, may have been their most deliberate choice of all. Because history, as we often learn too late, can be a double-edged thing. To be recorded is to be remembered, but it's also to be targeted. Once a people draw attention, they attract enemies. Invaders. Missionaries. Tax collectors. Kingdoms have crumbled under the weight of their own visibility. Fortresses become invitations. Roads lead armies. Maps make invasions easier. The Bayami understood this. Perhaps not in the way we modern people write about strategy and geopolitics, but in the deep, instinctive way that comes from centuries of observation. So they made a different choice. They didn't shout into the world. They whispered. When they traded, it was through middlemen. Their goods were valued, their amber and ivory and hawk feathers admired, but their origin remained vague, their location obscured by rumor. Some thought they came from the tundra. Others guessed deep woods. Even the traders who spoke to them face to face rarely knew what direction they had come from, or where they would go next. And when threats came, when the longboats arrived, when banners were spotted at a distance, when foreigners crept too close, the Bayami didn't stand and fight. They didn't wait to be overwhelmed. They vanished, not in panic. In practice, the elders knew where the temporary shelters were hidden. The trails not even the birds would fly over. They packed what they needed, tools, memories, fire-starting moss, and were gone before the first spear was raised. When their enemies arrived, they found only trees. Even those who sought them with good intentions were met with the same mystery. Missionaries came bearing crosses and promises, hoping to convert the so-called wild tribes of the north. But try as they might, they couldn't quite pin the Bayami down. A village here might agree to a sermon, then never appear again. A family might be baptized, but be gone before the next visit. Whole expeditions returned with vague reports, speaking of shadows and songs in the trees, but no conversions. It wasn't defiance. It was distance, and that's what truly baffled the outside world. Most tribes, when threatened, either fought or surrendered. The Bayami did neither. They didn't rage. They didn't bow. They simply weren't there anymore. To some, it seemed cowardly. To others, it felt mystical, but to the Bayami, it was neither. It was survival. They had watched what happened to other tribes. Watched how the weight of gold or iron or faith could crush even the strongest people. Watched how villages became towns, and towns became taxed. How names were changed. How old songs stopped being sung. The Bayami didn't want that, so they chose to be a story instead, not a kingdom. Not a nation. A story, and that, in the end, is what we're left with. Bits and pieces. Hints and half-memories. A whisper in a folk tale. A feather tied to a spearhead in a grave beneath the moss. Something that feels like history, but reads like legend. The Bayami didn't disappear because they were conquered. They disappeared because they chose to. Because being unseen was safer than being remembered too clearly. Because some stories are meant to survive not through books or monuments, but through wonder. And maybe that's why, to this day, their name sparks something in those who stumble across it. That flicker of recognition, even if you've never heard it before. That quiet hum in the back of your mind that says, "You've felt this before, in a dream, or on a foggy trail, or in the silence between trees." It's the feeling of being watched, but gently. Of being near something ancient, not hostile, but private. The feeling that somewhere in the forest, someone is watching, and weighing, and waiting. Not for war. Just for the moment to pass, the danger to move on. The Bayami live there, still, not as people, but as presence. And in a world that often rewards noise, that celebrates those who stand tallest and shout the loudest, maybe the Bayami left us with a different kind of wisdom. That there is power in quiet. That survival isn't always a matter of force. That sometimes, the greatest freedom is found not in being known, but in knowing exactly when, and how, to disappear. The story of the Bayami, when all is said and done, isn't just about the past. It's not merely a tale of survival tucked away in the folds of history. It's a quiet lesson, one that still speaks, if you're willing to listen. Because what the Bayami proved, more than anything else, is this: to resist a force stronger than you, you don't have to be stronger in return. You just have to be smarter. You have to understand the land you stand on like it's a part of your own body. You have to know its rhythms and moods, its hidden paths and quiet shelters, the way light falls on the water in late autumn, or how snow dampens sound in a pine grove. You have to make yourself at home in a way no conqueror ever can. Because when you are the land, when your spirit is rooted in it, then even the greatest invading force will struggle to shake you loose. The Vikings were strong, no one questions that. They were fierce, clever, well-armed, and fueled by belief in their right to expand. They'd crushed kings and burned cities. They rode rivers like roads and carved runes into the bones of Europe. But in the frozen north, in that twilight between Scandinavia and the unknown forests, they met something they couldn't quite wrap their minds around. A people who didn't stand still. Who didn't build cities to be sieged or walls to be broken. Who didn't fight fair, or direct, or on Viking terms. And that was the genius of it. The Bayami didn't win by overpowering their enemies. They won by making the fight itself seem pointless. Not glorious. Not honorable. Just cold, confusing, and deeply unprofitable. They dragged out the timeline. They filled the forests with dread. They turned each expedition into a miserable slog. They didn't humiliate their enemies, they wore them down. And little by little, the appetite to conquer faded. That's how you win against something bigger. Not by throwing yourself at it with raw defiance, but by quietly reminding it, this isn't worth your trouble. This is a kind of brilliance we don't celebrate enough. History tends to favor the flashy victories, the grand speeches, the battlefield triumphs. But the Bayami offered something different, a long, deliberate patience. A way of turning survival into strategy, of resisting through disappearance, of enduring not because you beat the odds in battle, but because you convinced the odds to leave you alone. They didn't challenge the world head-on, they sidestepped it, and in doing so, they exposed a truth many powerful empires don't want to admit: brute strength is only effective if the opponent plays along. If you refuse to be the kind of enemy they're prepared to fight, they often have no idea what to do with you. The Bayami didn't have iron armies or divine kings. But they had something the Vikings never really understood: control over uncertainty. They were shadows on the tree line. Voices behind the snow. Smoke that drifted just out of reach. And in that liminal space, between seen and unseen, they held the high ground. Because fear, after all, isn't always about violence. Sometimes, it's about not knowing what waits in the dark. And so the Bayami held on, not through dominance, but through elusiveness. Not through conquest, but through quiet cunning. Not through treaties or surrenders, but through the simple, persistent choice to remain who they were, just far enough beyond reach. This way of resisting, of surviving, has always existed, even if it doesn't often make the history books. It's found in the mountain tribes who scatter before every army. In the coastal people who move with the tides. In the storytellers who remember a language long after the last flag has fallen. It's found in those who choose to live differently, and refuse to be remade in the image of an empire. And today, if you walk the old forests near the Russian-Finnish border, or listen to the wind across a winter lake, you might still catch an echo of the Biami. A shape between the trees. A song with no known origin. Something that was never conquered, because it never gave permission to be. Their legacy isn't in castles or cathedrals or gold. It's in the wisdom of knowing when to be seen, and when not to be. When to fight, and when to let your absence be the answer. It's in knowing that sometimes the best defense is to become something not worth attacking, and that might be the most powerful kind of resistance there is. Not loud. Not violent, just quietly undeniable. So the next time you think about power, what it means, what it looks like, remember the Biami. They didn't win the way others did, but they're still here, in the myths, in the moss, in the way certain trails seem to vanish if you don't watch closely enough. They outlasted the storm not by standing tall, but by moving like water. Like wind. Like something the storm could never quite find. And maybe that's the kind of strength we should learn to honor, too. Have you ever heard of other small tribes that made mighty empires think twice? If you have, share them in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories, and if you believe tales like this deserve to be told, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a strange, forgotten story from the edges of history. Here at Thursday Now Storytime, we bring the quiet voices of the past back to life. One surprising story at a time. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.
máy là quay gỡ cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay không lại đâu. Không có đỏ. Nói xịt kìa chứ nói gì quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. Nó dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gỡ cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay không lại đâu. Không có đỏ. Nói xịt kìa chứ nói gì quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. gỡ cho anh Thịnh.
quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay không có đỏ. Nói xịn kìa chứ nói này rồi đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán